Good evening, everybody. Is the microphone too close? Is it good? Okay. All right. Whenever I showed up earlier to put my lesson on the board, it was right there, and I'm like, whoa, we're going to get that a little bit away. Y'all know me.
I don't need anyway.
Probably don't. Just to keep y'all awake after such a good supper, we're going to leave a microphone on. I want to thank everybody for being here this evening. It's such an honor and a privilege to have friends from Broken Bow and all the way from Colorado and anybody else that I missed that's drove in to travel that far to hear a message from God's Word. It really helps knowing that you're well supported. So I want to thank y'all very much. We're going to start this evening with Matthew the 23rd chapter. That's going to be our reading. And I usually don't do real long readings like this, but I think it's imperative in this case to read the 23rd chapter of Matthew, simply so we can understand what leads up to the 24th chapter, where our study is actually going to be. Okay? And we're going to do very little commentary on Matthew 23, but we're going to do a little bit. So let's start off with Matthew, the 23rd chapter, and verse 1 says, "Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples." So there's two different groups of people that Jesus is talking to here. Not only was his disciples present, but he was talking to the common people that had gathered there. Okay? And he's saying, "The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do you not after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." So even though the people had to obey the scribes and the Pharisees because they were in the position of power in Moses' seat, Christ didn't want them to be like them because those people were hypocrites. Okay? Starting with verse 5, it says, "But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries. They enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be ye not called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. And call no man Father upon the earth, for one is your Father, which is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that humble himself shall be exalted." So the scribes and Pharisees, the people that he's talking about here, they want to be somebody big. They want to be somebody great. They want to be the boss. Jesus said there's only one boss, and that was God. Then he explained to them that actually the servant, and not the boss, is the greatest in his eyes. Verse 13 says, "But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in." By their traditions, the scribes and the Pharisees were making it harder to get into heaven than even God himself had made it. And so they were going about it all wrong. In verse 14, he says, "Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make a long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation." You know, when it's talking about them devouring widows' houses, what comes to my mind is, remember the story of the poor widow woman, that after all the rich people had thrown in out of their abundance, the poor widow woman came up and she threw in 2 cents or 2 mites. I'm going to say 2 cents, that way the little ones can understand. But it was all that she had. Now, all that was required of her was 10% by the old law. But Christ brought his apostles over and said, hey, look, she threw in all she had. She threw in more than all they did. And Christ loved that kind of sacrifice and gift she made. But it makes me wonder if the Pharisees had played guilt trip on the poor and were robbing them. Could be. Don't know for sure. The 15th verse says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves." And a proselyte was a Gentile that had converted over to Judaism and gave up his life as a Gentile completely, honored to the traditions and customs of the Jews. And the scribes and Pharisees spent a lot of time trying to convert Gentiles over to Judaism. It was kind of like their crowning achievement if they could convince a Gentile to be a proselyte Jew. And then he tells them whenever they do convert one, they make him worse off than he was, because they teach him to follow their traditions instead of God's commandments, which they were already doing by nature. So he put them in a worse spot than that they were already in. In the 16th verse it says, "Woe unto you, you blind guides, which say, Whoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. You fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar is nothing, it is nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon the altar, he is guilty. You fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it, and by all things thereon. And whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it, and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth thereon. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe to men and anise a cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, but not to leave the others undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! You make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, clean first that which was within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like whited sepulchres or tombs, okay, like the kind that set outside where everybody can see them. For ye are like whited tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones, and of all uncleanliness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because ye build the tombs of the prophets, and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, and say, If we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Wherefore ye be witnesses unto yourself, that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers, ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell? Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye kill and crucify, and some of them ye scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city. So here Christ goes on and on and on about how bad a people they were, and how corrupt they had become. Verse 35 says, That upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of Zacharias, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachas, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. And here Christ proclaims a sentence, a terrible sentence upon that generation, that they were going to be accountable for all the righteous blood ever shed upon the earth. Verse 36, Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. Here he reaffirms, it's going to be you. What's going to be you? The responsibility of all the righteous blood ever shed from the beginning of time till then. They were responsible for it. Then Jesus cries over Jerusalem. Verse 37 and on. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth till ye say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. In the next two chapters, Jesus explains three questions that the disciples asked him that are in the beginning of Matthew, the 24th chapter. We're going to study these two chapters over the next couple of days, try to find out what Jesus' answers are to the questions that were asked of him by his apostles and what they meant. I don't think they were the answers that his apostles were looking for. But of course, we know and understand that they were the ones Jesus thought was correct. Before we get started in this study, there's some very basic principles we need to lay as a foundation to make sure that we get the correct understanding of what the Bible wants us to understand. The first one is that Jesus isn't only getting on to the scribes and Pharisees, but he's talking to the Jewish audience. So it's all the people at this point in time. The scribes and Pharisees, of course, being the corrupt leadership that's taken Jerusalem to a place of extreme disobedience. They did what they wanted. They made up their own laws that they wanted with their own commandments instead of following God. This is what chapter 23 is telling us. And that's why it's important to have it in front of chapter 24. So that we understand that Jesus is really getting on to these people in a way that he's never got on to his people before. He says, I'd have gathered you like a chicken does her baby chicks, but you wouldn't come. Always before in the history of Israel, they would go following false gods and false idols. They'd get a little spanking from God, and they'd come back and repent. They weren't repenting this time. They weren't coming back. I believe that Matthew, the 24th chapter, is one of the places in the Scriptures where you can look at the details of things. You can look at the trees and the rocks and the flowers and the bumblebees so hard that you don't understand that there's a forest out there. And I think that's what a lot of people do. You can get so involved in the minor details that you never see the story Christ wants to portray. The things that we're going to talk about over the next couple of days are futuristic events at that point in time. Meaning that they're going to happen at some time after Jesus talks about them. Some have already happened. Some have not. All through the Bible history, the events in the future have been foretold, all the way from Genesis 3:15, where Satan beguiled the woman and God put enmity in him, or hatred between us and Satan. At that time, God told Satan that the seed of woman would bruise Satan's head. And we know that that seed was a direct prophecy to the birth of Christ and him being resurrected from the dead and taking away the power of death. The Bible has a very indirect way of telling of futuristic events called prophetic or symbolic language. If you have any doubts about this, then please read Isaiah or Jeremiah or Daniel or Revelations. You'll understand what I'm talking about. In Matthew, the 24th chapter, the disciples are going to ask Jesus 3 questions. In their minds, all 3 questions relate to the destruction of Jerusalem. While Jesus answers all 3 of their questions, he also goes on to explain them in a different way. I truly believe that it's these 3 questions that's caused a lot of misunderstanding out there in the religious world. There are all kinds of fanciful theories about what these 3 questions and the descriptions of them and the answers of them are talking about. And it's mainly because people are taking what's being said and putting it in a context that it was never meant to be put into. They also start to stop the questions and the answers to them in places that were never meant to be done. I even believe that this is happening within the churches of Christ themselves. In the early 1970s, a man by the name of Max King and his father-in-law, C.D. Beagle, started an idea called the 80-70 theory. In this theory, they advance a lot of really weird stuff. The weirdest is the resurrection has already passed. It's over. And that Christ's second coming's already happened. I'm going to stop right there for a minute. The 2 books in the middle, I bought hundreds of dollars worth of books for y'all to take freely. The 2 in the center, the smaller ones, deal with the 80-70 theory specifically. The bigger stack on the side is called A New Heaven and New Earth, It's a lectureship I went to in Lubbock a couple of years ago that really helps define a lot of it. The one on this side is all 3 nights lessons, and we'll make more copies if we need more copies of those. Okay? In my study with these 3 questions, as in most of my studies, I went to 5 different commentaries. I want to make sure that what I preach is the gospel. All 5 of the commentaries were Church of Christ commentaries. Does that make them inspired literature? Absolutely not, people. Bible's the only thing inspired. Everything else is a commentary or man's idea on what he believes the Bible says. And I know some people, some friends of mine, they actually have a problem with people reading commentaries. But I don't. If you're sitting in the audience and listening to me tonight, you are listening to a commentary. My commentary. When you listen to someone else, you're listening to their commentary. Take what I say just like you do them books. Not as gospel, but as man's opinion. Okay? Of the 5 commentaries that I read, it's almost ironic that one of the commentators that I lean on the most heavy for his ideas and opinions is the one I disagree with the most on this subject. I'd venture to say that I agree with all 5 of these commentators in at least 90 to 95% of what they say and teach and believe. I believe that what we're going to go over tonight and the way it's going and the next couple nights is going to be in full faith of the gospel of Christ and the way that the churches of Christ have believed since the apostles' time. With these thoughts in mind, let's go to our Heavenly Father in prayer. In my defense tonight, I want y'all to look. I got like 18 inches squared where there ain't no scriptures, okay? Ain't gonna be that bad. Those that know me well know I don't usually give real short lessons. This is the longest one. I've told everybody, hindsight being what it is, after I actually got the lessons done, I should have done 4 lessons and broke this one in half. So I am setting a timer, and I'm going to have it up here, and I'm going to try to watch it pretty close. So we're going to go through it a little quicker than what I really wanted to, guys. And but I really think that you'll learn a lot. I hope you do. I thought I had it all figured out like most of my studies, and after I studied, I figured out I didn't have it all figured out. Changed my mind on several things, little things, and as I read different things, I come up with ways I'd never looked at it before. And so, with that being said, we're going to start with Matthew, the 24th chapter. And rather than say Matthew, the 24th chapter every time that we go to a different verse, I broke it down as much as I could there. You're going to be in Matthew 24th chapter most of the time. Once I make a comment or whatever, I'm going to say verse 6, and we'll take off from there or whatever, okay? And save me a few words and you a little time. All right, starting with verse 1 says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and the disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple." One of the foremost things that we need to understand is that the disciples were very impressed with this temple. Okay? It was like a pinnacle of achievement in architecture, in wealth, and in beauty in the days that they lived. It was truly an awesome achievement. Okay, verse 2. Jesus said unto them, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." What Jesus tells the disciples here absolutely floors them. They are astonished by what he said. What we need to understand is these rocks he's talking about, these stones, some of them were as long as 40 foot long 12 foot tall, 18 foot wide, and would weigh 100 tons. They're massive. They're huge, huge rocks. And it's claimed that the temple and the buildings surrounding the temples covered about 19 acres. So immediately what comes to the disciples' mind, his world's coming to an end. Wouldn't you think so? What else can destroy something so magnificent, something so huge, something so well built, so fortified, unless it was the end of the world and Jesus coming back? So because of their thinking, they asked Christ 3 questions. Verse 3. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And so now we actually come to the 3 questions that were asked by the disciples. We're only going to focus on the first question tonight, okay? Tomorrow night we'll hit the second one, Sunday morning we'll hit the third one. And the question we're going to look at tonight is, tell us, when shall these things be? The disciples were wanting to know, when is this tragedy going to happen? When is it going to be so bad that these rocks are going to be demolished where there's not one on top of another? I think that put fear in the disciples' hearts, don't you? What in the world could destroy this? Verse 4. Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. One thing that we want to realize is that all of this prediction from now till verse 35, which is going to be our ending tonight, revolves around the destruction of Jerusalem. So Christ starts off a warning to them to not be deceived. And then he goes on to explain why and how they would be deceived. And that's because there's going to be a lot of false prophets come, claiming that they are Christ or that they are sent from Christ. One commentator says this, in describing Jerusalem's downfall, it is not Jesus' purpose to provide a program of the event so to satisfy the apostles' curiosity. Rather, it is to give them the benefit of warning and protection. There is a possibility that as they see Jerusalem's demise, they will be deceived into expecting Christ's return at the same time. Jesus wants them to realize that the downfall of Jerusalem has no bearing on his personal return. The Jews have longed for someone who will overthrow the Romans and restore the political sovereignty to Israel. In reading Josephus, we understand that there was a man named Thaddeus from Acts 5 and 36, an Egyptian from Acts 21:38, and Simon Magus from Acts 8, 9 through 10, who all claimed to be from Christ during the destruction of Jerusalem. Jason, go get me a water, please. Thank you, son. You're going to bring me mama's. All right. I tell you, wives really are handy things, guys. If you ain't got one, get you one, okay? If you got one, do everything you can do to keep her. Verses 6, 7, and 8. Jesus goes on and tells them, And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in divers places. All of these are the beginning of sorrows. One commentator that I really like has this to say. It says, Josephus records that during this period, wars occurred in Caesarea, Damascus, Scythopolis, and Ascalon, leaving tens of thousands dead. Surrounded by such cruelties of war, it might be easy for the apostles to be afraid and prematurely abandon their mission of preaching the gospel. Jesus wants them to know that such events, though awful and terrifying, are not the immediate signs of the end of Jerusalem. In the face of war, famine, pestilence, and earthquake, the apostles are to remain committed to preaching the gospel. In Acts 11 and 28, it mentions a famine which happened in the days of Claudius Caesar and affects not only Judea but other parts of the world. A famine that is followed by pestilence and the deaths of thousands. Another commentator notes, many ancient writers also attest to the frequency of earthquakes during that time period. He says that Cedri, Samaria, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossus, Campania, Rome, Pompeii, and Judea also suffer earthquakes. We're going to stop right there. I got 16% of those names right, okay? Just letting y'all know. We butchered them, okay? And that's the way it usually goes. But there was a lot of earthquakes going on during that time period. It is significant that Jesus tells us, those of the first century, that such disasters do not mark the end of time. Natural disasters, however devastating, simply mark a creation that travails in pain because of sin. Contrary to premillennialists, all the catastrophes mentioned above do not mark the end of anything. Rather, they mark the beginning of sorrow. The word sorrow literally means birth pains or travail. He suggests that the word travail points to a new and better things that lie ahead. The fall of Jerusalem, in reality, marks a new era for Christians. As pain comes before a child is born, so will there be pain as Christianity emerges victorious through the womb of Judaism. I thought that was well said. Y'all. Verses 9 and 10 says, Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. And ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. In the book of Mark, it actually records a more detailed version of these last two verses. So let's take a look at it. Mark 13, 9 through 13. It says, But take heed to yourselves, for they shall deliver you up to councils, and in the synagogues ye shall be beaten, and ye shall be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them. And the gospel must first be published among all nations. But when they shall lead you and deliver you up, take no thought beforehand what ye shall speak, neither do ye premeditate, but whatsoever shall be given you in that hour speak ye. For it is not ye that speak, but the Holy Spirit. Now the brother shall betray the brother to death, and the father the son. And the children shall rise up against their parents, and shall cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. In the infancy of the church, many of the disciples and apostles were put in jail and delivered before governors and kings and authorities for the defense of the gospel. And the gospel records a couple of them. Let's take a look at one in Acts, the 5th chapter. Verses 38 through 42. Acts 5, 38 through 42. Guys, I printed it all out on my scriptures. It sure is easier through these trifocals to read big letters. And I'm getting so old and crippled I can't carry a big Bible. So I'm stuck. Okay, Acts the 5th chapter, starting with verse 38, says, And now I say unto you, refrain from these men and let them alone. For if this counsel or if this work be of men, it will come to naught. But if it be of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest haply ye be found even to fight against God. And to him they agreed, and when they had called the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. And they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house they ceased not to teach and preach Jesus Christ. We know that this is a story of Peter and the other apostles. They had actually been caught for preaching the Word of God and The people accused him of making a riot over it, you know, and they were actually going to kill Peter. And a Pharisee named Gamaliel talked them down and said, you know, guys, if these guys are really from God, like they say they are, we fight it, we're just fighting against God. So let's not do that. And so they just beat them and let them go. You know, we get beat every day, right? Preaching the gospel. No, I ain't never been beat. I ain't even had no good fruit thrown at me in years, so, you know, it ain't really that bad. And these guys were happy that they were counted worthy to be beaten for him. But Jesus told them before, while he was still walking on this earth, he said, it's going to be bad after I'm gone. Another example that we have is the Apostle Paul being delivered to Felix, the governor, in Acts, the 23rd and 24th chapter. And that's just two of them where the apostles or the men that were preaching the word were brought before, just like Jesus had told them they would be brought before authorities. Verse 11, Matthew 24, verse 11. It says, and many false prophets shall rise and deceive many. And we have an example of this back in Acts, the 5th chapter, where it talks about a couple of different guys that were tearing people away from the Jewish tradition, claiming to be from God. In Acts 5 and 34, this same council, the same chapter of Acts says, then there stood up one in the council, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a doctor of the law, had in reputation among all the people, and commanded the apostles put forth a little space. In other words, guys, get these guys in another room, let's talk about this. And he said unto them, ye men of Israel, take heed to yourselves and what you intend to do as touching these men. Now this is the same story just at a time earlier that we just read. But Gamaliel makes a point to him. He says, for before these days rose up Thaddeus, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who was slain. And all as many obeyed him were scattered and brought to naught. And after this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of taxing, and drew away much people after him. He also perished. And all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. So there's just example after example after example that during this time period that there were a lot of false teachers, a lot of false people claiming that they were from Christ. Verse 12 says, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Now realize that Jesus is telling them the signs leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. All these things are going to happen before the destruction of Jerusalem. This thought takes my mind to Revelations, the 2nd chapter and verse 4, where he says, nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. What does iniquity mean? And because iniquity shall abound. Iniquity is lawlessness, which a command from God is a law, and if we break that law, it's sin. So iniquity is lawlessness, or us taking God's law and being disobedient to Him. And because of that, the love of people was going to grow cold during that time. Now, the church had started on the day of Pentecost, not too long after this, and it was going. But Jesus told them, well, you're going to lose a lot of people from it. And it's all because of iniquity. Reminds me of the parable of the wayside. It says that a sower went forth to sow seeds, and some of them fell by the wayside. And the devil come and stole them, devoured them up. I think that's what happened during this time period. Verses 13 and 14 says, but he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. And then shall the end come. As my turkey went off, didn't it? Somebody texted me, they don't know what's happening tonight. That's all right, we'll forgive them, go on. We'll answer that later, of course. But Jesus makes a statement here. He says, everybody that endures to the end is going to be saved. And of course, when he's talking about them people there, he's talking about the church that was in Jerusalem. And he said this gospel's got to be preached into all the world, and then the end shall come. And a lot of people in the premillennial world today look at that and go, oh, the end of the world. No, we're talking about the end of Jerusalem, people. End of the world ain't in the question yet. Understand that. Here Jesus makes the declaration that before the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the end of the Jewish age, or their world, that all this previous stuff has to happen. And since we understand that that didn't happen until AD 70, well, they had 40 years to preach the gospel to the entire known world. Jesus said it would happen. When we read these last two scriptures here, our mind can drift into all kinds of possibilities that Jesus is talking about. And this is where a lot of our fanciful ideas start coming in and trying to take hold of the book of the Bible here. And it takes us to places and theories that were never meant to be. When Jesus talks about these last two verses here, about the gospel being preached unto all nations before the end shall come, he's starting to answer the questions that the disciple gave him there on the Temple Mount. Here he's going to actually begin to tell them about the destruction of Jerusalem, what to look for before it happens, or the sign of thy coming. And he's going to tell them about the destruction of Jerusalem, which they understand to be the end of the world, or the Jewish age. And Jesus is going to answer their questions in an earthly, physical sense, but he's going to take the last two questions and answer them in a spiritual sense to explain to them that the end of the entire world is a lot more important than the end of Jerusalem. So now he's going to start with the abomination of desolation here in the 15th verse, which begins the actual destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew 24 and 15 says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Now I want you to know that there's 3 places in the book of Daniel that talk about the abomination of desolation. They're Daniel 9, 24 through 27, Daniel 12 and 11, and Daniel 11 and 31. To get a good understanding of what the abomination of desolation is, I think it's imperative that we go to Luke's account and see what he says. Because it's at this very point with the abomination of desolation that people go way off in left field in the wrong direction. Listen to what Luke 21:20 says. He says, now let's hit Matthew 24:15. Get to Luke and we'll hit Matthew 24:15. It says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. What does Luke say? He says, and when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. See how Luke puts it so we can understand it? He's talking about armies being the abomination. And the desolation is the destruction of Jerusalem. Here he's taking prophetic language and making it to where the Greeks can understand it in Luke. The Roman armies were going to encompass Jerusalem and completely destroy it. Not one of them big rocks upon another. The destruction, of course, would be that desolation, and the Roman armies, of course, would be the abomination that were carried out. Why are they an abomination, you might ask? They weren't God's chosen people. And if you weren't Israelites, you were an abomination to God. Their sinful, godless ways were an abomination to God. Matthew 24, starting with verse 16, says, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Once you see the armies, and you know what's going to happen, let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And pray ye that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Here Jesus wants to impress into the minds of the people there, the disciples, an absolute urgency that when they see the Roman armies encompass Jerusalem, to get out, and get out now. He starts off by telling them, run! Get out of here as fast as you can. Don't delay. Let's move, people. Let's go. Like trying to beat the kids out the door to go to church on Sunday, ain't it? Let's go. Let's move. Get out now. Jerusalem's going to have a bad day. You don't want to be here. He wants to impress in their mind so greatly the need for urgency and speed that he tells them that if you're on a housetop taking a nap, yep. And during those days, that's where most Jews took their naps. They were flat roofs. They put their cots up there and took a nap in the middle of the day, soaking up the sun. And he said, if you're on the housetop, that's why it talks about the housetop so much. And said, if you're up there taking a nap, if you're up there on your housetop, said, don't even go inside and get nothing out. Just get off your roof and get gone. Don't worry about it. He wants to impress in their minds an idea to run far and to run fast. Get out of there. If you're in the field, don't even go back to your house and get anything. Just get out of there. Leave. And ladies, I hate it, but he tells y'all, I'm sorry ladies, it's going to be worse on you. If you've got little infant children or babies nursing, it's going to be harder for you to get out fast. You're going to have to corral the kids, bring them with you. It's just going to be more difficult on you. There ain't nothing I can do about it. But you need to leave. Now. In church history, there's a man named Eusebius who writes a book, and in chapter 5 in a footnote, the following is written. But the people of the church in Jerusalem had been commanded by revelation, that revelation right there, vouchsafed or made sure of, to approved men there before the war to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Perea called Pella. So even our historians from way back in the 1st and 2nd centuries talk about the revelation that God gave to the early church for them to leave when they saw the armies surrounding them to get out. Okay, so now the question kind of arises. Why would the Roman army, after they've surrounded Jerusalem, give anybody a chance to escape? Notice the time frame. Jesus says, after you see the abomination and desolation, get out. Not go out and look for it 25 miles out and before it gets there take off, but once you see it. Well, why would they let them go? Okay, to quote a commentator named Mike Criswell, he says in AD 66, and my dad told me some about this, but Mike just explains it real well. In AD 66, some years before the final onslaught against Jerusalem, but during the period of increased skirmishes with the Jews, Sextius Gallus marches on the holy city, a Roman general, and has every chance to overthrow it. Josephus notes, and Josephus is one of the best historians of the time period of the destruction of Jerusalem that ever has been. Okay? Josephus, it's funny, the Roman army paid him to write it down, to take notes and record the history. Okay? Josephus notes that upon entering the city and setting up camp in one of its newer suburbs, and even after burning part of Jerusalem, he retired from the city without any reason in the world. Josephus notes of Cestus and quotes, says, who, had he but continued the siege a little longer, would have certainly taken the city. Josephus goes on to say that at Cestus's retreat, many of the most eminent Jews swam away from the city as a ship when it is going to sink. Sounds like part of them took it serious, didn't they? Whenever they seen it and after the deal, they got out of there. Yet another chance for departure comes a few years later when Vespasian, Rome's most famous general, halts his Palestine overrun and returns to Rome. Vespasian opens to his campaign in AD 67 against the Jews from the Syrian port Peloponnesus after heavy resistance, tramples Galilee with an army of some 60,000 men. When word arrives that Nero has committed suicide, however, Vespasian returns home to assist in political stability. In AD 69, after the short, successful reigns of Gaba, Otho, and Vitellius, Vespasian is universally proclaimed emperor. His son Titus, who himself in 10 years will become the emperor, continues the persecution of the Jewish horde, and in AD 70 becomes the instrument of God's hand destroying the holy city in the temple. So there was two different times from the very beginning of the attacks on Jerusalem, which was about 4 years before AD 70 and about 66, when the first general started attacking and for whatever reason just left and went. And then whenever Vespasian had just started his attack, he had to leave because the emperor was slain. And he knew that his chances of becoming emperor were great. And so he left Titus in charge, but Titus was still traveling to there, if you read Josephus. And then, so there was a time period there when one left and the other, before he got there, that they could have escaped also. There's something else that I want to impress on your mind, and commentary by Mike Criswell says it best. He says, there's no hint that Jesus is speaking of the end time or of some great global catastrophe, as so many premillennialists assert. Jesus reminds his listeners in verse 34, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. The instruction that begins here and continues through verse 34, while perhaps bearing similarities to the final judgment, speak to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. 21st verse. We're going to hurry up, guys. I know. We're going to start with 21st verse. And then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor shall ever be. I can't stand here and tell you of all the horrible things that happened during the destruction of Jerusalem. Not only from the Roman armies, but also from the Jews and their factions fighting amongst themselves during this time. Josephus records some horrible, horrible things that happened during this time. A lot of horrible things that come from starvation and the desperation that the people were under just to get a bit of food. Mothers beating their children and killing them to take their food. Mothers even roasting and eating their own children, their own infant babies, is recorded in Josephus. There were different factions of the Jews that would come and rob other Jews, sometimes 2 and 3 times a day, rob the same people and take their food with brutal force. Most accounts record that 1.1 million died during this war, and over 90,000 were carried off as slaves. Josephus is recorded to say, accordingly it appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to these of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. Matthew 24 and 22 says, and except those days be shortened, there shall no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. In the Gospel Advocate Commentary, H. Leo Bowl says this. He says, history records that Titus was determined to reduce Jerusalem by famine, a long destructive mode of conquest, and for this purpose he surrounded it with a wall and a ditch. After completing his preparation for this attack on the city, he received news from Rome, which urged him to hasten back to Rome. And he changed his plan and pressed the city by assault, that he might return to Rome where his presence was greatly needed. Hence, those days being shortened. The overruling providence of God shortened those days for the elect's sake. The elect has reference to the Christians who were among the Jews at this time. This elect group were to be preserved in order that the gospel might be handed down to future ages. Another commentator by the name of Jack P. Lewis says that Titus's war that he waged on the Jews only lasted from April till September. 4 months. And he took them. Verse 23 says, then if any man say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christ, and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before, where if they say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in secret chambers, believe it not. Here again Jesus gives warning of false prophets and false Christs coming during the destruction of Jerusalem. Notice I say again, because Jesus says it again. In verse 25 he says he told us before, and we know that in verse 5 he told us that that would happen, the false Christ and the false prophets. Our next verse, verse 27, is one that is taken so far out of context by so many people in the religious world. It says, For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. And people take this verse and say, look, it's talking about the end of the world, all of this. This isn't the destruction of Jerusalem. No, people. Well, this verse is talking about the end of the world, and that Jesus' second return is going to be as a brilliant flash of light. And whether there's actually a light or not, I'm not going to stand here and tell you yes or no. But it's going to happen that fast. Boom, and it's going to be over. But it's the exact opposite of what's being told in verses 23 through 26. In verses 23 through 26, when they're talking about the false prophets, they say that they're going to be hidden. Jesus says, I'm not going to be hidden. I'm going to go boom, baby, and here I am. And the whole world will see me when I come back. It'll be all at once. Verse 28 says, For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. There are several different ideas with several different commentators on this. But I believe Mike Criswell says it best. Jesus depicts Israel as a dead body. A carcass already fallen, with birds of prey hovering above the carnage. Israel's moral, political, judicial, and spiritual condition is beyond resurrection. Rome, as a vulture in waiting, knocks at her gate. Thus, the point of this verse is clear. The disciples are not to expecting the Messiah, no, not Jesus, to appear personally to save Jerusalem. In God's sight, Israel's dead meat. The next three verses constitute the most confusion of Matthew, the 24th chapter. It's within these three verses that the confusion is so great that even the commentators in the Brotherhood don't agree on what it's talking about 100%. E.M. Zer was under the belief that it's talking about the Dark Ages and the church coming out of it. B.W. Johnson and H. Leo Bowles both believed that the question had changed and was now talking about the end of the world. But my own personal belief runs parallel with Mike Criswell. We believe it's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the things that will happen. Let's read those three verses. It says, Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Let's take a look at these individuals. And I'm going to start paraphrasing for time's sake, people. We're going to speed it up even a little more. If you want a more detailed deal, it's right down there, okay? It says, Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun's going to be dark, and the moon shall not give her light. The stars are going to fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven's going to be shaken. The word immediately is key to understanding this verse. Commentators who believe that verses 24 through 28 refer to Jerusalem's destruction, while verses 29 through 31 refer to the end of the world, have a difficulty explaining the use of this word. Because if part of it was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the rest of it's supposed to be immediately, brothers and sisters, I missed the immediately. If part of it was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, part of it's talking about the end of the world, and Jesus says right in the middle of it that it's going to go from destruction immediately into the end of the world, what are we? Don't make no sense, does it? Such vivid vivid language leaves many to assume that Jesus can be speaking only of His second coming and the end of the world. And at first glance, the language seems terrifying enough to say so, to suggest a catastrophic end to the earth. However, when this passage is examined in light of prophetic language, it parallels other Old Testament passages that refer to the demise of nations. Describing the fall of Babylon in Isaiah 13 and 10 says, For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light, the sun being darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. In Isaiah 34, 4 and 5 it says, And all the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all the hosts shall fall down as a leaf falleth off the vine, and as a fallen fig from a fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven, behold, it shall come down on Edomedia, and upon the people of my curse to judgment. Here the language is highly figurative, isn't it? And no one would assume that the heavens would literally be rolled together as a scroll. If these had been literal occurrences to the end of the world that must have come, then judgment must have fell on those people at the end of the world, and that's preposterous. The language is the same. Whenever God destroyed the heathen nations of old, and He used language like that, He used the same whenever He is talking about Israel. That's what we need to realize. It's not the end of the world. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with great power and glory. This sign is not Jesus Himself, but one that originates with Jesus, and undeniably shows that He has taken His rightful place in heaven at the right hand of God. The destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 fulfilled this sign. With this Holocaust, Jesus' claims of being the Son of God are vindicated. And God has demonstrated once and for all that He's done with the Jewish nation. With AD 70, spiritual Israel is vindicated and shown to be the nation of God. If Judaism had been allowed to hold its sway with its shadows and cardinal ordinances, it would have been a hindrance to spreading the gospel. God was now through with the old covenant made at Sinai. Holding full sway was the sign of the new covenant. Some have mistakenly assumed the passage. It says, And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, refers to a visible and literal reign of Christ. But there's nothing here to indicate a coming by Christ on earth or little reign in Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, there's not a single verse in the New Testament to indicate that Christ will reign upon a material throne in the material city of Jerusalem. This thought has been imported by carnal interpretation of Old Testament passages, because Christ is actually now seated upon His messianic throne. I think verse 31 is pretty neat. It says, And He shall send His angels with the great sound of the trumpet, and they shall gather together His elect from the four ends, from one end of heaven to another. We automatically assume that this has got to be angelic beings. But consider this, people. The word angels can be translated into several different words, and one of them is messengers. And he was talking about the disciples preaching the gospel of Christ at that time, and that they would be gathering people into His church. And this is not the end of the world testimony, but the beginning of the church testimony. Verses 32 and 33. I never understood when I was young. Through reading all of this and understanding to a degree as a young one that it was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, it says this. It says, Now learn of the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that the end is near, even at the doors. I just couldn't understand that as a kid. What in the world does that got to do with the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, it's kind of like a parable, guys. You know, the leaves have just started budding here pretty good. They're bigger than squirrel ears now. And we know because of them leaves coming on, the winter's over, don't we? Well, Jesus was telling them, whenever you see these false prophets, when you see these earthquakes, when you hear these wars and rumors of wars, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the Roman armies of the abomination of desolation, know the end is near. It's happening right now. Verse 34 is the most important of all. It says, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. This is not symbolic language in this verse, people. This is simply stated that this is going to happen during that generation. And generation back there was considered like a 40-year span. That's what they thought a generation was. And we know that it was about 37 years till the actual destruction of Jerusalem. The last verse, 35, says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Jesus here makes the solemn oath that it's going to happen. He said, heaven and earth might go, but what I'm telling you is going to come to pass. To finalize question 1, when shall these things be? We'll go again to Brother Mike Criswell's commentary. He says, with this verse, Jesus ends his discourse on the destruction of Jerusalem. In minute detail, he has answered the first question asked in verse 3. When shall these things be? He has given the discernible signs that will aid Christians in escaping the Jerusalem Holocaust. In my words, the premillennialists and AD 70 theorists have taken this part of the Bible and made an absolute mockery out of God's Word. They have taken the destruction of Jerusalem and made it into an end world event that it never was. They have taken the blessed resurrection and said that it's already over and done. And we have assurances from the Bible itself that it's going to happen one time at the end of the world. And when that happens, it won't just be Jerusalem, it'll be the whole world. So I want to leave you with one thought we learned in verse 4. Take heed that no man deceive you.